please welcome the co-founder and CEO of Partners in Food Solutions, Jeff Dykstra.
Good morning. Dan Buettner, our first speaker, is an explorer, National Geographic Fellow, award-winning journalist and producer, and New York Times best-selling author. He discovered the 5 places in the world, dubbed blue zones, where people live the longest, healthiest lives. His articles about these places in the New York Times Magazine and National Geographic are 2 of the most popular for both publications. Buettner now works in partnership with municipal governments, large employers, and health insurance companies to implement Blue Zones projects in communities, workplaces, and universities. Blue Zones projects are well-being initiatives that apply lessons from the Blue Zones to entire communities by focusing on changes to the local environment, public policy, and social networks. The program has dramatically improved the health of more than 5 million Americans to date. His books, The Blue Zones, Lessons for Living Longer from People Who've Lived the Longest, Thrive, Finding Happiness in the Blue Zone Ways, The Blue Zone Solution, Eating and Living Like the World's Healthiest People, and The Blue Zones of Happiness were all national bestsellers. Buettner has appeared on The Today Show, Oprah, NBC Nightly News, and Good Morning America, and his keynoted speeches at TEDMed, Bill Clinton's Health Matters Initiative, and Google's Zeitgeist. His speech in January 2018 at the World Economic Forum in Davos was chosen as one of the best of Davos. And finally, as if all that is not enough for one person, Buettner holds 3 Guinness World Records in distance cycling.
Thank you. Thank you. I've had the good fortune over the past decade or so to attend dozens of these sorts of medical conferences, and I can honestly say the lineup here is more impressive than I've seen anywhere. So I want to salute Manova and Mark Addicks for once again putting Minnesota at the forefront of the United States. So I'm going to talk about the world's longest lived people and some of the counterintuitive and indeed inconvenient lessons they offer us for living longer. But first, I thought we'd have some fun. I'm a big believer that if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. So I thought we'd start with you today and begin by measuring each and every one of your life expectancy. And in order for me to do that, I need to ask you 8 simple questions, and your job is to raise your hand when the question pertains to you. And then the hard part here, first thing in the morning, is remember how many times you raised your hand. So you're ready. 8 easy questions. They start easy and they get hard. Raise your hand if you get at least 7 hours of sleep most nights. 7 hours of sleep most nights. All right, well rested. Raise your hand if you move at least 30 minutes a day. At least 30 minutes a day. All right, most of you, healthy crowd. Raise your hand if you eat at least 3 honest servings of vegetables every day, and French fries and ketchup do not count. All right, I'd say over half of you. Raise your hand if you have not, and I underscore, not had unprotected sex with a stranger. I want to hang out with you guys at happy hour. Raise your hand if you belong to a faith. Belong to a faith, keep them up if you show up at least 4 times a month. All right, there's 3 more hands, okay. Raise your hand if you have 3 friends who, number 1, you can have a meaningful conversation with them. Number 2, you can call them on a bad day and they'll care. And number 3, you actually like them. There we go. Welcome. Raise your hand if you have not smoked in the last 5 years. Not smoked, and I mean tobacco. You can keep your hand, okay. Almost all of you. And finally, raise your hand if you believe you have the health and the desire to reach age 90. Health and desire to that's actually the best predictor. But when you ask all 8 of these questions, you get a really good prediction. And these are based on the assumption that the average age of the audience, the population, is 50. And looking around, I can tell you guys are much younger than that. But if you're a man and you raise your hand twice, your life expectancy is 75, and if you're a woman, it's 79. If you raised your hand 5 times and you're a man, life expectancy is 82, and if you're a woman, it's 86. And if you raise your hand 7 times and you're a man, life expectancy is 89, and if you're a woman, it's 93. Did anybody raise their hand all 8 times? Anybody raise their hand all 8 times? We have a lady here. Anybody else? Ma'am, could you stand up? Ma'am, could you please stand up? Could we give her a huge Manova round of applause? You're now dismissed to the liquor lounge. The rest of you, I have something to say. All right, something called the Danish twin study established that only about 20% of how long we live is dictated by our genes. The other 80% is dictated by lifestyle, and I'm going to argue hard, environment. So based on that assumption, about 15 years ago, funded by the National Institutes on Aging and on assignment for National Geographic, I hired a team of demographers to identify the demographically confirmed areas where people are living longest. And then after hiring that team, another team that could help me go to these places and distill out the common denominators, the things that most highly predict longevity in these places. And remarkably, no matter where you go in the world, and there's an extraordinary level of life expectancy or centenarian rate, you see the same 9 common denominators. And I'm going to tell you what those 9 common denominators are. But first, I'd like to very quickly take you to each of those blue zones, especially since I have the benefit of National Geographic photography. The first blue zone we found off the coast of Italy on the island of Sardinia. High in the highlands, there's a cluster of 14 villages, 42,000 people, where you have the highest concentration of male centenarians in the world, about 10 times more than you'd expect to see among an American cohort. So the biggest predictor of reaching age 100 here in Sardinia was your job. Shepherds were living longer. The second biggest predictor was how many daughters you had. The guys most likely to reach age 100 had 5 or more daughters. Now, we don't know if that's because daughters tend to take care of their aging fathers, or if you can survive 5 adolescent daughters, making it to 100, it's no problem. But either way, it seems to work. A centenarian living today in Sardinia, for about half of his or her life, their diet, the first half consisted mostly of bread and a type of cheese, and the second half of their life consisted mostly of a variant of the Mediterranean diet, mostly fruits and vegetables, a type of wine that has the highest levels of polyphenols. It's called Condinau. Nothing like dirty boots to add terroir. You can get it at Surdyk's, by the way. And some meat, but on average they were eating meat about 3 times a month, and a portion no bigger than this clicker. More important than their diet was their social determinants. They had a fanatic zeal for the family, an enormous respect for elders. They never warehoused their aging parents in a retirement home, something that immediately knocks off years of life expectancy. Instead, they harnessed their wisdom, their agricultural know-how, their resiliency know-how, their dietary know-how, and put it to work in younger generations. And indeed, something called the grandmother effect has shown if you have a grandmother involved with a grandchild's life, that grandchild has lower rates of morbidity and lower rates of disease. On the other side of the planet, 800 miles south of Tokyo, on the archipelago of Okinawa, the world's longest-lived women, about 30 times more female centenarians among women over 60 in Okinawa than you'd expect to see in the United States. They also have the longest disability-free life expectancy in the world. They live a long time. They die very quickly with very low medical bills. How do they do it? Well, again, part of the answer is their diet. Centenarians living today, until they were about 60, about 70% of their diet came from one food alone. Sweet potatoes, because it was typhoon-proof. All other plants got blown away. They eat about 6 times more tofu than we do in the United States, and lots of turmeric. I would say those are the 3, but mostly, overwhelmingly a plant-based diet. Meat about once a month on average. And again, the social determinants of health are driving the bus. I asked you that question if you had 3 good friends you could count on a bad day. That's the question the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation uses to assess loneliness. If you're lonely in this country, it shaves about 8 years off of your life expectancy. As bad for you as smoking 15 cigarettes a month. In Okinawa, they don't have to worry about it. When children are as young as 5, they're put into committed social circles called moais, 5 people who travel through life together. They support each other through thick and thin. The reason I show this picture here is these 5 girls have belonged to the same moai for 97 years. Their average age is 102. They get together every night, gossip, drink sake, argue about who that hot guy liked best back in 1942. But they really still look out for each other. There's no word for retirement in Okinawa, none of this artificial punctuation between your useful life and your life down in Florida. Instead, they stay involved. You see 102-year-olds still teaching martial arts, people still bringing home food to the family in their 90s, and women still taking care of their great-great-great-granddaughter into their 105s and even 110s. The word they use to define life after 60 is ikigai, meaning roughly knowing very clearly the reason they wake up in the morning. We found America's blue zone about 80 miles southeast of Los Angeles off the San Bernardino Freeway. Seventh-day Adventist. They are conservative Methodists who distinguish themselves from other Christians in that, number 1, they celebrate their Sabbath on Saturday, and number 2, they evangelize with health. For a long time, Adventists have been proclaiming they're the healthiest subculture in America. And indeed, the National Institutes on Health has financed a huge study following 103,000 Americans for 30 years, gold standard epidemiology, to see if they really are healthier. So life expectancy for American women is about 80, but for Adventist women, they're living 9 years longer, and for men, the difference is even more remarkable. Adventist men live 11 years longer. Adherent Adventists are living about a decade longer than their North American counterparts. Why is that? Do they somehow have better genes? No. If you look at an Adventist congregation in Loma Linda, it looks like a Lutheran congregation in St. Louis Park. You have people mostly from European extraction, but also Hispanics, African Americans, and Asians. They do a few things differently. They take their Sabbath very seriously from sunset on Friday until sunset on Saturday. At night, Friday night, they focus on their family. Saturday morning, they attend their religious ceremonies. They do plant-based potlucks at noon. Hardwired right in their religion, right in their scriptures, is a nature walk on Saturday afternoon, the definition of which has evolved over the decades. And they take their diet directly from the Bible. Genesis chapter 1, verse 26, every plant that bears seed and every tree that bears fruit. So they're eating either a vegetarian or a vegan diet. They take the Bible quite seriously. Adventists hang out with other Adventists, so the contagions that are circulating through their social network tend to be positive contagions. We now know that health behaviors are as contagious as catching a cold. This is the culture that has produced Ellsworth Wareham, 95-year-old multimillionaire, very happy to do his own yard work, but on the weekends he goes to the hospital not for open heart surgery, but to do open heart surgery. Ed Rawlings, a 106-year-old cowboy who starts his day with a swim, and on the weekends he puts on the boards. And my favorite, Marge Deton, 105 years old, wakes up at 5:30, reads her Bible, has her oatmeal, to which she adds soy milk, nuts, and some raisins, and then she follows that by what she calls a prune juice shooter. Ponder that for a second and move it right on out. She pumps iron, rides her bicycle, and then gets in her Cadillac where she barrels down the San Bernardino Freeway, where she still volunteers for 8 different organizations, including the Loma Linda Senior Center. You guys don't know this about me, but I've actually led 17 fairly hardcore expeditions for National Geographic, including one that crossed the Sahara Desert without sunscreen. But I can honestly tell you that I've never been on an adventure more harrowing than riding shotgun with Marge Deton. 2 days in a row. A stranger's a friend I haven't met yet was her great line. I wrote up these 3 cultures in the first Blue Zone book. I was 38. For the first time in my life, I had money. And like a good explorer, I immediately turned around and blew that money hiring the demographers that helped me do the story. We went out looking for more blue zones, found one in Central America on the Nicoya Peninsula of Costa Rica. This place has the lowest rate of middle-age mortality in the world, which means they have the best chance of reaching a healthy age 92. And they do so spending 1/15 the amount we do on health care. Part of their recipe includes arguably the healthiest diet the human species has ever invented. 3 foods: corn, which they grind into wonderful tortillas, beans of all kinds, and then squash of all kinds. And when you combine all 3 of those foods, they're rich in complex carbohydrates, trace minerals. Combined, they provide all the amino acids necessary for human sustenance, and they taste good, the most important ingredient of all. And finally, we found the last blue zone about 30 miles off the coast of Turkey on the island of Ikaria, Greece. Very remote island, largely overlooked by Western civilization. Here's a place where they're living 8 years longer than Americans are living, but most extraordinarily, they suffer about 1/5 the rate of dementia that we do. The United States, if you manage to reach age 85, there's about a 50% chance you're suffering or beginning to suffer from dementia. In Ikaria, it's about 10%. They adhere to the strictest version of the Mediterranean diet around the whole Mediterranean universe. And also they drink teas made out of 4 herbs, which we had tested and discovered that all 4 of these herbs are both anti-inflammatories and they lower blood pressure, which may have something to do with the conclusion, the formula. I like to tell the story of this fellow right here. His name is Stamatis Moriaitis, Greek, an Icarian who moved to America as a young man, got a job painting houses, made good money, bought a house in the suburbs. But at age 66, felt short of breath. 3 doctors diagnosed terminal cancer. So instead of dying in Detroit, he moves back to Ikaria, starts breathing the air, eating the food, drinking the wine, reconnecting with his religion. After 6 months, he's actually feeling pretty good. He goes and plants a vineyard. No hope, he thinks, of actually living to see any of those grapes blossom, but he thinks my wife will, and my wife will think of me. Well, to make a long story medium, 34 years later, when I met him at 102, he was harvesting all of those grapes, making 200 liters of wine a year and drinking it all. So, of course, as a good journalist, I asked him how he got to live so long. And I was pretty sure it wasn't his ability to match plaids. And he just kind of shrugged and he goes, I don't know, I guess I just forgot to die. Which sounds flippant, but actually he hit the nail on the head. In places around the world where you're seeing spry people in their 80s, 90s, and 100, it's never because they tried to live a long time. They never said at age 50, well, go darn it, I'm going to get on that longevity diet now and live another 50 years. They don't buy a Stairmaster or join a gym or call that 800 number and buy supplements. The epiphany here, and this took me 8 years, perhaps I'm a little slow, took me 8 years to figure it out, that in nowhere is longevity or even health successfully pursued. It ensues from the right environment. No matter where you go and you see longevity, people aren't exercising in the way we think of exercise, but they move naturally. Every time people go to work or to a store or their kids go to school, it occasions a walk. Their houses aren't full of mechanical conveniences. They have gardens out back. My team figures that instead of sitting around their house and then thinking they're going to get enough exercise at the gym at the end of the day, they're nudged into movement every 20 minutes or so. They suffer from the same stresses we suffer from, but they shrug this stress and the inflammation that follows by saying prayer, doing ancestor veneration, taking naps, or happy hour. They have vocabulary for purpose. When you know your sense of purpose, it's worth about 7 extra years of life expectancy over being rudderless in life. When it comes to what they consume, they're drinking a little bit, 1 or 2 glasses a day, but no, you cannot save up all week long and have 14 on the weekend. My book, Blue Zone Solution, worked with Harvard University to do a meta-analysis of all 5 blue zones for the last 100 years, 155 studies. So if you want to know what a centenarian really ate to live to be 100, here it is. 90 to 100% plant-based diet, mostly a high-carb diet, but complex carbohydrate, flies right in the face of paleo or keto or these other fad diets. The 5 pillars of every longevity diet in the world are greens, grains, tubers like potatoes and sweet potatoes, nuts, and beans. If you're eating about a cup of beans a day, it's probably adding about 5 years to your life expectancy. They do eat meat, but a lot less than you might think, a lot less fish, about 3 eggs a week, no cow's dairy of any kind, and when it comes to what they drink, it's water, tea, coffee, and a little bit of wine with the meal. They not only focus on what they eat, they also have strategies to keep from overeating, confining all of their meals in an 8-hour window, so they have 16 hours for their food to digest. They eat big breakfasts. There's no electronics in their kitchen. These are all strategies to keep from overeating. And then the foundation of every blue zone in the world is they keep their aging parents nearby, invest in their spouses, invest in their children. They tend to be religious, which imparts 4 to 14 extra years of life expectancy. And they surround themselves with the right people. We now know that if your 3 best friends are obese and unhealthy, it increases your own chances of being unhealthy by about 150%. So what your grandmother told you, show me your friends, and I'll tell you your future, was very much the case in these blue zones areas. So we spend a lot of money in this country trying to preserve health. We're going to talk about it for the next 3 days, or at least trying to get sick people less sick, which is usually the case in the United States. But we spend most of the preventative dollars on diets, supplements, and exercise programs. They cost a lot of money. They're not necessarily a bad idea in the short run, but in the long run, they universally fail. If I could convince 100% of you guys to get on the perfect diet, I would lose 10% of you in 3 months, 90% of you in 7 months, and almost all of you in 2 years. We are hardwired for novelty. Exercise programs, we tend to start them with lots of zeal at the holidays and run out of gas by September. And even if I'd come back from the blue zones with the pill guaranteed to reverse aging, we wouldn't stick with them long enough to make a difference. So if that doesn't work, what does? Well, if you take a cue from blue zones, you see very clearly that they're the same clusters show up time and time again. People are eating wisely, mostly a plant-based diet. They're moving naturally because they're underpinned by purpose. They're surrounded by the right people, and they live in a place where the healthy choice is the easy choice. So I don't have to tell you guys that we have a huge healthcare problem in this country. 1/3 of us are suffering from diabetes or prediabetes. 70% are overweight or obese, and those numbers, by the way, are getting worse. We're now spending $3.7 trillion on largely avoidable healthcare costs. About 85% of all healthcare costs are from avoidable diseases. And for the first time in living history, the life expectancy of not only us, but our children is expected to drop by almost 5 years. Is that because we're stupid? Or we lack individual responsibility? Or there were better education programs in 1980 when there was 1/3 the rate of obesity and 1/7 the rate of diabetes? Or did our parents love us more than we love our kids? No. What's changed is the environment we live in. The number of fast food restaurants has gone up by a factor of 28. We spend twice as much time in our automobiles now than we did in the late 70s. You can't walk through an airport, go get gasoline, or even get the oil change in your car without being routed past a gauntlet of sugar-sweetened beverages, candy bars, and salty snacks. Raise your hand if your kids walk to school. Now raise your hand if you walked to school when you were a kid. Probably about 10 times more hands going up. We've engineered most physical activity out of our lives. We spend about 1/5 as much time in non-exercise physical activities than our grandparents have. The secret to longevity, whether it's in your life, the life of your employees, the life of your clients, does not rest with our doctors. Doctors are good at making sick people less sick. It doesn't rest with pharmaceutical companies. Pharmaceutical companies are in the business of making sick people less sick. They make no money if you stay healthy. It doesn't rest with our hospital plan. Hospitals are in the business of filling up beds. The problem in the United States with the whole healthcare industry is it incents for sickness and it hopes for health. As Jack Welch, the former CEO of GM once said, GE rather, General Electric, he said, it's folly to incent for A and hope for B. The system is incenting for sickness and we're hoping for health, and yet we're getting more sickness. The secret is taking the focus off of trying to change individual behaviors and shifting it to change people's environments, making the healthy choice not only the easy choice, but the unavoidable choice. I want to end here with a very quick story. Remember Stamatis Moriaitis, the 103-year-old Greek guy who said he forgot to die? I actually phoned him a couple years ago. I was writing about him, and it was early morning. It was at Caribou Coffee on Hennepin Avenue. I was using Skype. He picks up the phone in this little village in Ikaria, and we're chatting away for 10 or 15 minutes. And after a minute, he says, you got to hurry this up. I got friends coming over for happy hour. I said, all right, just one last question. I said, did you ever figure out how you got rid of lung cancer? That's incredibly rare. He said, yeah, I gave that a lot of thought. He said, 15 years ago, I actually went back to the United States to get some tests. And I said, yeah, what'd you discover? He said, nothing. I got back to the States and all my doctors were dead. Thank you very much.